The one test I found for myself is actually to try to read it out loud, because there's something about reading it out loud where you can more clearly feel, oh, I am myself losing energy when I'm reading this particular section. Maybe that should be shorter or shouldn't be here.
On this episode, I am excited to welcome back Thomas Wedell-Wedellsborg to talk all about the writing process. Thomas is the author of What's Your Problem?, a powerful book on how to solve the right problems. He's also the co-author of Innovation as Usual and has had his work featured in Harvard Business Review, The Economist, The Sunday Times, Bloomberg Business Week, and more. He was named one of HR Magazine's top 20 thinkers, which is so cool. And he's currently sharing his thoughts, ideas, and insights on his Substack newsletter. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thomas, welcome back.
Thank you, Kate.
I'm so excited about this conversation. We had such an interesting conversation just around the creative process and discovering what we should be creating. And today we're really focusing and talking about the writing process. And you have some great tips. You're a writer. You've written lots of books. You create a lot of content and put it out into the world for people to share. You share your ideas and you do it beautifully. So we're going to get into all that stuff. First of all, how did you get into writing in the first place? When did you figure out you had this love of writing?
I've always done it. It was when I was a kid, I was cross-eyed. And so I couldn't play sports very well, at least if the objective was to hit the ball. And instead I got into, I just read a ton. And somehow that quickly bled into me also liking writing. So even back to kind of middle school, I would be writing stories for the class, so like magazine or whatever, stuff like that. So that's just something it's a form of expression. That's always kind of been my default, I think.
Oh, interesting. It's kind of like with Stephen King. He talks about how he used to share stories when I think he started writing stories in high school, and that's how he originally got into writing.
Yeah, it's been a challenge actually more with both of my books. I faced like a period after writing it, because it's pretty intense, that I didn't want to write anymore. So that's been kind of a drawback to me. And that's like the first time in my life after my first book, I experienced, I don't feel like writing anything right now. Because as you well know, writing a full book is a pretty writing heavy endeavor. And at some point you're just like, no more looking at keyboards from now on. I imagine many authors go through phases like that as well.
Yeah, that's why I thought it would be fun to talk about your writing process, because some writers have a very specific process and they are at their desk at 9 a.m. They write from 9 to 1, or they have a very specific schedule. Some that it's not necessarily about the time, it's about the number of words that they are writing on the page. So when you think about your writing process, what does that look like?
I'd say a high-level observation is probably just that this is the core quest for any writer, is to hack themselves and to find out what works for them. Because I think talking to writers, as you have as well a lot, it's very different. And there are some people who are really good at being disciplined and sitting down every morning from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock and churning out the 1,000 words. For me, it's nothing that structured at all. I only have one strong writing hack I've discovered that fools myself into writing. And that is when I have breakfast, I eat that out of the house, and I take a research paper or something with me that is at least tangentially related to the thing I'm curious about or I want to write about. And there's something about the process of sitting and reading that as I have breakfast that kind of gets my brain beyond the initial resistance towards writing and just kind of into, I have an interesting thing I want to say. And then I'm off to the races. And so my days are either no writing at all or 8 straight hours of writing. And there's nothing really in between. I've never been capable of sitting down for an hour and writing something meaningful and then doing something else with that day. So I'm not sure this is a thing to be emulated, but that's what works for me. And I think that's kind of the key thing. What have you seen with
Well, wait, I'm curious. If you look For the most part, if you were to look at your weeks on average, how many days a week are you sitting and spending a lot of time writing?
Uh, One at best. Ideally, I could write more if I were a disciplined person, or maybe if I had forcing functions in my life, which I don't really. De facto, when I have a week, if I get one day of like writing out of that, then that's a good week. And one day of writing, to be clear, is that immersive kind of, it is typically 8 hours or more that I'm sitting and kind of churning into it, because I think once I do get into it, I luckily have a bit of a hyper focus ability where I just kind of stay with it without getting tired. So that's kind of been the process.
What
Have you?
about when you're writing a book? When you're writing a book, are you more disciplined because you're on deadline?
Yeah, there are phases that are more deep dive, especially up towards deadlines, where it can become like a full on immersive thing. But I also find those periods very, very exhausting. Um, I think it's possible I do really good work in those, but I somehow suspect that my best work is done when I'm actually not trying to cram. So yeah, there's this trade-off I feel with I call them forcing functions, and a book deal is evidently a forcing function. You do commit to putting it out there, and that can be really helpful. But there's also, of course, that dance of like, you commit to it, and what if you commit to the wrong direction, or you are, I, I don't know. I have commitment issues in my life in general, maybe. So I'm not sure. It's again, I think it really comes back to that question of experimenting and figuring out what works for you. And for some people, I think the best thing they can do is to get a collaborator, because then that collaborator suddenly creates a structure for them that allows them to write, or give them a daily kind of sparring partner. For others, it is kind of doing a newsletter regularly or doing a podcast. And then a friend of mine, Henrik Verdelin, he's running a podcast, and then he takes ideas from that and kind of turns them into writing. That works too. So it is, I think, trying to hack yourself and figure out what really works.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think collaboration, I have definitely discovered over my career, I love collaborating on projects, and definitely writing the book, you do have more of a
Mm.
structure. It was easy for me to create the structure because I had, it needs to be at the publisher by this date and edited by this date. I always find it interesting how different writers have different processes for their creativity. It's interesting too that you choose an article. Do you choose that ahead of time? And I ask this specifically because I feel like sometimes we want to get inspired and there's so much content that if I get up and I think, "Oh, I wanna read something or be inspired or in some way to write about a specific topic or learn more about a specific topic," then you can get into the weeds, and now you're consuming more than you're actually creating. So how do you decide what article to have on hand in that morning so that you can be open to giving yourself that knowing what you're gonna talk about?
I found two things to be helpful. I mean, this can also be a book, I think, but articles, I mentioned that because a lot of my writing is scientifically based. So I always try to go in and really understand what is the like current state of knowledge in academic journals on a specific topic exploring. And I think that can be maybe not necessary for all forms of writing, but evidently that's going to probably produce a higher quality outcome when you're actually bringing in the scientific research on the topic, even if you disagree with it. But I think there is something, you're just reading about a fascinating study that somebody did on creativity, and you're starting to kind of translate that into your world or your reader's world and say like, oh, what does this study actually mean for us? Or how does that nuance some kind of thing we think about creativity or whatever topic you're writing? The other thing, and this is maybe more provocative, the other thing that can help is to read other writers on my topic, on the thing I'm writing, because I often disagree. Sometimes I find something like they've discovered a really great nuance that I hadn't thought about. I love that. That's always amazing. And other times I go like, no, this is right, this is wrong. Somebody must correct this. And then I get fired up to kind of make some kind of point against what I've been writing. I don't necessarily cite it directly, but I just like, you read something in your field and you're noticing, oh, that's funny. They're actually not covering this aspect of it, which is a really relevant aspect. And then you think, I want to write something about that. Again, I think it comes down to experimenting and figuring out what triggers you. It might be that it's not writing, but sitting and listening to a podcast on a topic or what. The important thing I think is I'm not writing just to consume. I am kind of using it as a trigger for my own writing. And I'm aware of that when I start reading it, I'm looking to engage with it, not just to consume, if that makes sense.
Yes. No, that's definitely a different way to consume if you're looking to engage or use it in some way. So I know a lot of listeners are either writing a book, have a dream of writing a book, they have some ideas. Because you've written so much, what advice do you have, like some writing tips that you have discovered over the years that you love to share or that you think would be helpful for us?
I think a lot of my thoughts on that comes back to trying to get more effective at writing as well, because you can spend a very long time trying to, for instance, write a book. So let me give you one of the most helpful things. Let's say you want to write an article. You have this thing in mind. It's a great topic. What I found incredibly helpful is to not start with a blank page. Many people just kind of start, open up a document, sit and type whatever they do. And that becomes a jumble completely. One of the most useful things to do is to understand, like, where do I want to publish this? And then you go in, let's say you decide it's the Atlantic. Then you go in and find a couple of very popular articles that you really like, and you almost reuse the structure of the article. What I mean with structure is kind of, for instance, going in and saying, oh, I'm noticing they have a habit of the first two paragraphs, I outline some kind of important problem of tension. The next paragraph describes briefly who you are and what your expertise around this. Then the next paragraph goes into your solution, and then there's like 3 pieces of advice around how to do it. My point is, by borrowing structures from existing articles, you just speed up your writing process to an incredible degree, because it kind of forces you to think along the lines of what the finished product could look like, versus the approach of I'll write 1,000 words every morning, which to me has never really been helpful. I know other writers do find it helpful. So going in, finding a book or an article or whatever you really like, and try to see if you can reuse not their content evidently, but the way they write it. And this could be anybody from, I don't know who your favorite authors are, but it's probably a good idea to both find something you really like, but also maybe glance at what's been really popular with their readers to the extent you can see that. So you've also got a sense of like, oh, this is actually this is a known structure that works. We know it already works. Now, how can I think about how to take my ideas and put them in that form? One additional comment, I think it also helps you target the publication, because it's actually sometimes, especially with top tier publications, you're going to have better chances of getting it accepted if you have already done it in the way they like the house style, if you will. And magazines, as you know, they're very different. Like, they have very different both styles and approaches to what level of evidence they want to see. Do they always want to start with a story, or are they? How do they approach those things? So I think that's probably one of the best accelerants of writing something useful quickly.
It's interesting that you went to what publication. I wasn't thinking about it from that perspective. I was thinking about it more just writing in general, but I've written for magazines. I used to have a column this years ago, and it was so interesting to have a real editor and just learn what they found valuable versus what I did. And then you have to, what's that term? You have to kill your darlings. And I feel like there were like certain pieces that I was like, wait, you want to get rid of that whole section, but it didn't flow the right way. So what I find interesting around books, like if you look at the top selling books that have sold millions and millions of copies, like something like Mark Manson's book, The Subtle
Oh yeah,
Art of,
yeah,
or James Clear, Atomic Habits. That's a very interesting one just because it's a very specific style, but more like personal development books. Even Matthew Kelly, who has written over 40 books and have sold probably 100 million copies of his books. Or Ryan Holiday is another one of my
yeah.
favorite authors. The way in which they write is so thoughtful. It flows in a way that feels very like they take high level ideas and they simplify it so beautifully that when you read it, you almost think, duh, but also that's so profound.
Yeah.
It feels that's just it flows. There's this sense that you really you can really tell that they were very intentional about how they structured it. If you're reading an article in a magazine, I feel like
Mm.
it's really good storytelling. David Sedaris, I don't know why his name just popped into my
Yeah.
mind. Like, he's such a phenomenal storyteller, and how you tell the story in a way that you're keeping the attention of the audience, and that means that if you remove a sentence, a word, you add like you could add the smallest thing or remove something and it just changes. Verling Klinkenberg wrote
Yes.
this book. Is it Several Short Sentences About Writing?
Yes. Yeah.
And he says something along the lines of, it's important to know what you're trying to say, but it's essential to know what you've actually said. I'm butchering it, but it's something
Yeah.
it's something around that. It's a beautiful piece because it's so true, right? As a writer, we're thinking, "Oh, I wrote this is what I said," but the way that somebody is reading it might not be the way you intended.
I mean, that's almost where we get into editing. And editing is not just the formal, like editing done by an editor, but also the editing you do during your own writing. I don't know, people do this very differently, but I edit as I write. So I will go quite slowly through a piece and kind of keep returning to it and tweaking it and so on. And then only when I'm pretty happy with how that piece has turned out, then I move to the next one. A lot of that is just that your sensibility for what flows well. My problem is I do this with everything I write. So if I write an email to somebody to take me off their email subscription list, I also kind of read through it 2 or 3 times to make sure that this is crafted well and that this is maybe not a good idea.
Oh my gosh.
I can't help myself. So that's I think there is an art to knowing when not to. I think this also, I think it mirrors that idea of seeing it with the reader's eyes, which is kind of what you're doing in part as an editor. And that actually links to what we discussed about, for instance, picking the publication. Because I think by picking the publication, in a sense, it's not just house style, you're also picking your audience. And maybe more specific, picking your audience, their stance as they come into your writing. Because I'm sure that the same person, for instance, reads The Atlantic and Harvard Business Review, but when they come to Harvard Business Review, they kind of come to it with a maybe more pragmatic mindset and kind of saying, hey, what's something I can use to deal with something that's going on in my work? If they go to The Atlantic, it's probably more with the stance of like curiosity or kind of concern about a societal thing that's happening or whatnot. And if you don't understand that audience or the publication you're writing for, it's going to be a lot harder to edit because you don't know what's salient. Like, which examples should you use of the many things that your idea means? What do you talk about? The societal impact, the individual impact, the corporate impact, a fourth thing. All of those things is really anchored on that core question of like, who are you writing for, and what is that person's stance when they come to your book? I don't know if that kind of resonates, but I think books that understand that have a much higher, They're easier to edit when you understand it, and I think they have a higher likelihood of becoming a success.
Yeah. You're so funny because your writing, the way in which you approach writing is like the opposite of what so many that I talk to around in two ways. This might just be the only two, but one, so many writers I talk to, they write every day. It's a very consistent practice for them. If it's not every day, maybe they skip a day, but they write every day. And then the second thing is when you said you edit while you're writing, I have read so many authors that talk about they, the way that I learned it was called the vomit draft. So it's always like you
Mm.
just get it all out on the page. It's supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be horrible. It's just getting all of your ideas out onto the page. And that's what you do. And so editing should come much later. You have to just get everything out there. So those are like two conflicting ways that you
Yeah.
do it versus what so many writers talk about.
Well, I think that the value in that is in part just the recognition that there are multiple different ways to do this. I
Yeah.
think there's a science fiction author I really like, Ada Palmer, who has this phrase like that all authors do the same things in a different order. So that's just kind of,
Mm.
and I think that's in a sense true. Where do I deploy the heavy writing? In my note taking? Like, so what I will do on any given day, I will have some random thoughts that pop into my head and I immediately jot them down into like a note taking app or whatever. Critically, I don't really review them. It is not an act of kind of like building a huge set of notes on some topic. It is more that I find that writing them down strengthens my thinking around it versus just kind of having the thought. There's something about writing that crystallizes ideas. And so that's probably the context in which I create what, the equivalent of a lot of writing or the shitty first draft or whatever that is. It's a filtering mechanism for me. I would say when I did at one point when I wrote my first book, I did start out with a document. I just put everything in there I had in my mind around innovation that might be interesting to put into the book or whatever. And what was significant to me coming back to it later was that it was probably of those, I think it was 40 plus pages, there's probably half a page. That was what the book ended up being about. So it was this weird, almost a throat clearing exercise for me to just put it all out there and then understand it versus I think the book would have become horrible had I tried to use that full 40-page document as my first draft, so to speak.
That's something that is, I feel, important for the writing process. I think it was Joan Didion who talks about how she writes to understand what she's thinking.
Oh,
That
yeah.
you get the words out to really understand and to better crystallize all the thoughts that are in your mind. I've written some poems where I'll write the whole poem and then it's the last two lines that I love the most. And I think, wait, no,
Yeah.
this is the start of a different poem. I'm going to scratch this whole thing. But I never would have gotten those two lines.
Yeah.
So that's part of the process.
I agree. I think that the problem for me with the whatever 1,000 words a day approach is if people don't subsequently then filter those products hard. I sometimes run into, manuscripts or whatever, where it's clear that the writer just went on a stream of consciousness journey and thought it was a book. It's terrible for me. That is like, I start pulling out my hair. What I love is when you can see a writer has kind of picked a topic and then thought deeply about that topic, focusing on it, like versus the listicle. And then this other thing happened, and here's a fascinating fact from blah blah. Those things are terrible to me. Might be a matter of personal taste. Much stronger when it's clear that the writer has kind of found a good focal point and really goes into depth with that idea, or at least as a red thread that unites all of it. I don't know. I
Yeah.
think everybody in the writing world. What are some of your pet peeves? Like you must have run into things where you realized, oh, I hate this thing when authors do this or whatnot.
Oh my gosh, I was just gonna bring up your pet peeve too, so we got to get into.
Yeah, but let's hear your first.
We got to get into neuroscience, but I have to think about, because I was just about to say not a pet peeve, but as you were talking on what we appreciate about writers, is like the person that came to mind was Tim Urban. Wait, but why? He has
Yeah.
that blog. I mean, he is such a thoughtful writer and art, like his little stick figure artwork. And then also his TED Talk is one of the most watched TED Talks on
Yeah.
procrastination. It's so good. And there's just this simplicity. So I think when some of my pet peeves, it's kind of similar to you. It reminds me of like acting
Mm.
looks really easy. Acting looks easy on you're like, "Oh, I could have been on this show. It looks really easy." Acting looks easy until you see a bad actor and you're like, "Oh,
Yeah.
wait a second." And so when you read so many great books, and you and I both have a love of books, you read so many great books, and then when you read a book and you're like, "Ugh," you notice some things, and it really comes down to, you can tell they didn't really flesh out the idea. You can tell it was almost like they were stretching. I definitely have read books where I feel like people almost wrote the book just to say they wrote the book, and it's almost like they wanted to use it as like a business card. You don't get the feeling of this person really understands what they're trying to teach someone. You get more of the feeling of, oh, this person's just kind of putting a bunch of ideas on a page, and they didn't spend a lot of time really thinking through that. And I think what I appreciate about writers, and kind of going back to Ryan Holiday, just because he's someone who speaks very openly about his writing and the
Hmm.
thoughtfulness behind his writing, and the thoughtfulness of how he creates books that build on themselves. And he has like a trilogy, and like he has, or even someone like Austin Kleon, who has his 3 books that build
Yeah.
on one another. That to me just feels like they just put so much love and care into the book. And then some authors, it just does not feel that same way. And so I love books that you can just tell they've thought so much. Like even Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act. That book is so beautifully written. And I didn't know his work in the music industry, which is crazy because I
Hmm.
know he's like super famous. But reading his book, you can just tell he like lives, eats, and breathes this stuff. And
Yeah.
that's what I really appreciate. And that's honestly, even with your book, what I really appreciated about your book, and I mentioned this on the other episode, because I thought that this was already a unique superpower in you, but you said that it does take a lot of time for you to figure this stuff out, is that it was so thoughtful. The way that you laid it out and the framework that you developed, it didn't feel forced. It felt very much like you had spent a lot of time thinking through what each of the pieces of the framework would be to help people actually use it.
And I mean, that almost comes back to a different type of writing habit, which is, I think it's Clive Thompson, a writer I really like, who pointed out that when people think they have writer's block, in reality, they have researcher's block, meaning they haven't spent enough time talking to people or observing things in the real world to understand the richness of what they're writing about, just trying to kind of conjure it up from their subconscious. I think the reason I was capable of writing a good book, I hope, on these matters is that they were building on several years of working with this thing with real people in my field. And real people meaning people who are on the front lines of running a business or doing some real world, as opposed to being an author, which is not in the real world, as we all know.
Yep.
Uh, but I think that that's like you hone your intuition for figuring out what's the right structure, what's the right focus, what are the right cases, by having interacted with the world on your topic and seeing where people, otherwise smart people, what they get wrong and what are the key points that they need to understand that you need to convey in order for them to do a better job with whatever you're writing about. So I think a lot of that comes down, it's not a magical intuition, it's just having been immersed in something for a while that you then start to understand what a prospective reader needs, I think.
Yeah. So tell
Um,
me, so can we get into
Pet
your pet
peeves.
peeve? Because
Yes,
I didn't get to hear
I
about
have
it.
a very
Before we
specific
hit
one.
record, I got to hear that Thomas has a pet peeve of neuroscience.
Yes,
So let's get into that.
at the risk of making some enemies now, but well, it's part of under an umbrella that's a bigger pet peeve, which is filler material. I hate it when I can sense that an author just kind of is trying to fill pages. That's terrible. And the very specific form of filler material that I detest the most is the neuroscience detour. First, a caveat. Some neuroscience writing is good, and neuroscience is a fascinating field. So it's not the field I mind. It is the way in which some authors use it to basically bullshit. I called this, this is an author called Cordelia Fine who first pointed this out, and she did an amazing job of it. When you read in a book, let's say a business book, some section about your hypothalamus or what's going on in your frontal lobe, 9 times out of 10, you can just strike out all the neuroblather and the sentence has not lost informational value. Like, it's still saying the same thing. And sometimes it's like it's used to dress up something super banal. Like, when somebody threatens you in a meeting, here's what happens in your brain. It's fascinating, blah, 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 neuro. And then you feel defensive. And it's like, okay, when you get threatened, you feel defensive. That's profound. I mean, my point is, it feels like maybe it's luckily soon on the vein, but it feels like there's a period of time where people almost use neuroscience as a way to dress up poor arguments or banal statements in something that sounds scientific. Because, like, oh, this person understands the ventral ganglia, then they must be really smart and I should listen. And you are realizing, again, 9 times out of 10, it's just filler. And it's I don't know. I as you could tell, I have strong feelings about this, and I think that I am being unfair to the 1 in 10 author who actually includes it because it does matter for what they're saying, or they do it really well. What other pet peeves would you add to that list?
That's so interesting. Well, it's funny because you made the distinction of it's not that you don't like the field, because correct, the field is very interesting, right? It's interesting to learn that stuff, but is it necessary? That just goes back to the best writers, they know what to leave in and what to take out. That's why I remember Matthew sharing with his, because he's written so many books. Some of them are smaller. Like one of his best business book, The Dream Manager, it's only about 150 pages. So everything that he puts in there is awesome. Now, he might have had to write 80,000, 90,000 words to get to that core, however many words it is. So I feel like that's where, when you said you hate when it feels like authors are trying to fill pages, I laugh because I really just think that most business books could be like half of what they are, but it is challenging. The editing process can be really challenging, what to leave in and what to take out. And sometimes what to take out is, hey, just this is an article. This is something else. This might be like a compliment to the book.
I feel it's always better to err towards taking it out. When I look at my books, there's nothing there where I felt like, oh, I should have said more about that. There are several places where I said, like, I could have cut that part. It's almost always stronger when you strip out the unnecessary part. Not unnecessary, but even like the not that interesting parts. The one test I found for myself is actually to try to read it out loud, because there's something about reading it out loud where you can more clearly feel, oh, I am myself losing energy when I'm reading this particular section. Maybe that should be shorter or shouldn't be here. Another thing that, of course, is super helpful there is to get input from others. Like, even this bit, by the way, it's not only Mark Manson, he mentioned it as well, but one of the best advice for getting input on your writing from non-writers, meaning not the person who's written a book, but just one of your friends who's willing to put in the time to read some of it, is to equip them with like an orange and a green highlighter, and simply tell them, read this. Whenever there's something you enjoy or find fascinating, give it a green highlight. Whenever there's something you find boring, incomprehensible, or whatever, give it an orange highlighter. That will allow non-professionals, so to speak, to give you really valuable input. They can't necessarily tell you what's wrong with it, but they can tell you when they're bored or when they're not understanding a point you're making. I use that with both my books, and I found that to be super useful, especially if you can get a couple of people to do it for you.
I love that advice. I don't remember who I heard this from, but when they said to do that, what was helpful was they said, if they try to tell you why it's not working, they're usually wrong.
Yeah.
That's your job as the writer. But the fact that it's wrong, that it doesn't feel a certain way for them, that's the hint. That's where you
Yeah.
need to decide how you're going to go. But however, I forget who it was, but it's always wrong. How they tell you to fix it is never right.
I I found that the exception is if you. I was lucky enough to get the input of one of the people who read my manuscript was for the second book was Dr. Stone, who did with Sheila Heen and Rob Patton the Difficult Conversations book. And he is so good that he could also tell me what the problem was and even suggest some, here's maybe one or two ways of potentially thinking about it. So there are people who can do it, but they are typically themselves really good authors. So it's an exception. If you have a friend like that and they're willing to do it, you're lucky.
Yes. Yeah, for sure. All right. So Thomas, if somebody is listening and they're thinking, okay, this is all great. What is one thing if somebody wants to write their book? What is one thing that you would encourage them? They have the idea for the book and they need to kind of get started. What is one piece of advice you would share with them?
Start with an article. Writing a book is a huge endeavor. Writing an article is a significantly smaller endeavor. There's no drawback to writing an article before you write the book. On the contrary, it can create interest in the book if you're hoping to attract a publisher, for instance. And it's a really good way to basically date your idea before you get married to it. So if you're thinking about writing a book, maybe see if you can first create a really strong article on your idea. And maybe that'll turn out to be enough. Maybe you realize through that process that either the idea isn't that interesting, or B, it's great, but actually the article is now getting popular and I don't need to write a book on it. I can move on to another thing. So that's kind of I would say, the core advice I tend to tell people who tell me they want to write a book.
I like that. Awesome. You know what I would want to know from all the people that you gave that advice to? How many people actually wrote the article? I feel like so many people talk so much about writing the book, and then you tell them to do the simpler thing, and they don't even do that.
That is true. There are some that advice. You don't have to take it, of course. But I think many people are just so enamored of the idea of becoming a book author that is what they want to do regardless. It should be said, that fit me too as well when I wrote my first book. I was also not thinking about an article, and that prolonged the process a good deal. I don't remember if I told you that, but my first book, when we put that together, it needed significant revision because I had this idea that I want to be. At that time, I was fascinated by Malcolm Gladwell's ability to tell stories. He is a master at that. And I was kind of trying to become Malcolm Gladwell without having his storytelling talent. That one needed, it got a major rewrite after we had actually gotten a book deal on it. And that prolonged the process with almost a year. So I think that can help.
Oh my gosh. Interesting. All right. Well, Thomas, thank you so much again for coming back on. It's always a pleasure to chat with you and see you. And I hope that the listeners are inspired to write their article and create whatever writing process. And I appreciate that you say everyone is different. So take what works for you and leave the rest.
Exactly. Or if they're not inspired, maybe they now run away screaming from the idea, which can also be a good outcome. So yes. I'll let your listeners judge that for themselves.
So there you have it. Go write an article. I actually really do love that advice because a book is such a big project, but writing an article, you can sit down and write an article in a couple of hours. Think about a topic that you find fascinating, that you are interested in, that you think, oh, I could really write a whole book about this. And when you start with an article, you're forcing yourself to gain some clarity around how you even really think about that topic. What about it makes you curious? And what do you really want to say? What do you have to say that you believe would be thought provoking or you believe would be really helpful to the reader. Do you enjoy hearing people's writing process as much as I do? There's something that I just love about hearing how someone gets their work done. And it's interesting because, as Thomas said, everyone is different and you get to hear different people's styles, different people's process, and then take what works for you. And as long as you create something that helps you achieve your goals, whether it's writing a book, an article, a newsletter, video scripts, whatever your goal is in writing or creating anything, as long as it supports that, then that's great because it works for you. So there's not this cookie cutter way of doing anything. It's really, hey, we get to learn from the greats, learn from the people that have done it really well. And sometimes their process just might not be in alignment to how we work. But guess what? There's someone else that's probably equally as successful and their process looks a lot different. So, hey, take what works and leave the rest. I hope you found this helpful and you're taking at least one idea to help push you forward in your creative project. Thank you so much for being here. And until next time, go create something.